presentation.
So my name is Olga Rostapshova, and I'm a postdoc at NBR, and I also work for social impact. So it's a pleasure to go after the two talks that immediately preceded me, because I'm actually going to be building on some of the ideas that were developed in those experiments. And my experiments are actually based in developing countries. I'm a development economist, and this work is actually a lab-in-the-field approach. So while doing some RCTs related to public good provisions, we noticed that different villages have extremely different rates of cooperation. And some of them find it relatively easy to provide threshold public goods within their community, whereas others have a lot of difficulty and are unable to raise enough money to reach the thresholds. So in addition, there was a lot of heterogeneity among the different residents of the communities, with some people contributing a lot and being very charitable, so to speak, and others not. I mean, this is very similar to any community, but here this was really making a difference in terms of whether local public goods are being provided. So the context is actually Western Kenya, and through my previous work, I found that 14 of the 25 communities were able to provide a water infrastructure treatment chlorine dispenser to basically ensure that their water they were drinking was chlorinated, and this is something that they had to pay for. And this was a very small cost, but this is a situation in which even contributing 5 to 10 cents per household was very difficult to achieve in some areas, whereas in other areas it was very easy. And this is not a situation in which people couldn't afford this, because 5 to 10 cents even in this area is very reasonable. So in this study, I wanted to study which factors and mechanisms are responsible, and I used the lab-in-the-field design combined with survey data on the demographics and getting information about the players. So specifically, the reason that I wanted to study these issues in this village is that people know each other very well in this village. And they're very small. There are about 40 to 60 households in each one. There's little mobility, so people really know each other extremely well. They have a lot of interaction with each other, strong family and social ties, and very strong history of collective action. There's a lot of community giving for burials within churches. There are credit microfinance organizations, etc. So this is something very familiar to people. In addition, there's a lot of local norms that are very different by village. There's different, and I'll talk about this a little bit later within the context of my results. And there's different sanction institutions. Because you live in this close community, obviously you have to be fairly generous, because otherwise you might be expelled from the community, or you might not be able to reap the reciprocity benefits later on. So this is an example of the type of public good that we were working on within the context of the RCT, and this work, the lab and the field work, was done in the RCT villages that I was working on for a different project. So this is an example of a communal water source that everybody in the village uses, and this is an example of a public good. So this device essentially chlorinates water, allowing people to gather water in this little bucket and then use the chlorine dispenser. So this, the price for this dispenser is about, the subsidized price is about $5, and split between everybody in the community, this is actually maybe 20 cents for a couple months of using this water for the entire family. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to study the impact of social capital, so village-specific levels of cooperation, and also look at different people and why they choose to contribute or not contribute. And this is slightly different from charitable giving, because this is actually giving to a public good that you will be using. It's non-excludable, so that even if you don't give, you still can use it, but it's a slightly different flavor in that you're providing a service for yourself, and you can either choose to free ride on other people's contributions, or you can choose to contribute yourself. So specifically, I decided to look at 3 different factors. First, social accountability mechanisms, so the impact of reputation and the inequality and fairness norms that exist in these communities. Second, I wanted to look at individual preferences and beliefs, so beliefs about what other people in the community would do, and preferences about how altruistic you feel, how much warm glow do you get from contributing. And then finally, the impact of asymmetric conditions. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is things like differences in income and limitations to how much you can or can't contribute. So what I did is I did a threshold public goods game in a lab within the field. And I had 4 different treatments that looked at these effects of symmetry, social accountability, and fairness norms. And the 4 treatments are a little bit complicated. I'll explain them in more detail later. So for those familiar with a typical threshold public goods games, I just did several different treatments that played upon different versions on the game. So one is so all of the games were simultaneous, so all the contributions happened at the same time. In the first treatment, there was a difference between whether or not your contributions were revealed to everybody playing the game after the game was finished, and then the revealed treatment. And then in anonymous treatment, there was no revealing. Everything just remained secret. We just said, okay, the group met the threshold or it didn't meet the threshold. In the second treatment, I restricted the contributions by removing the focal point, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But basically, if in a lot of threshold public goods games, there is usually a fair contribution, which is essentially the total endowment for the group divided by the number of players. So this is something that is, that given the low education level of people playing this game, we had to explain this very clearly. And we actually tested our players to make sure they understood this point and other rules of the game before playing. And then the people who were not able to understand the rules of the game were not selected to play it. And this is, in this situation, basically what we did is we gave, for each game, people had 10 tokens. Since there were 10 people playing the game and the threshold was 50, it was fair that each person would contribute 5 tokens. So each person had 10, and then they would contribute 5, which would be the way that if everybody contributed, you would meet the contribution. So what I also did is I said, okay, well, your tokens are now worth 2 each, so you can only give 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And the reason I did this is to subtly remove the focal point, so you could no longer give 5. And as I'll show you later, this was really useful because obviously a lot of people ended up giving 5 when you're allowed to give anything. And then third, I examined the difference in play when people had asymmetric endowments. So instead of giving everybody 10 tokens, I gave some people 5 and some people 15. So this basically was explained to people as, okay, in this round, some people will be poor, some people will be rich, and 5 people will get the endowment that's very small, and 5 people will get the endowment that's very high. And then next round, there was a switch. So we actually got data for both the poor treatment and the rich treatment for everyone. And then the last feature of this game was that we gave people a second chance to meet the threshold if they failed to do so in the first round of play. So for the groups that were short of the threshold, we said, okay, well now actually we're going to give you a second chance to contribute from your endowment. And they did not know this was going to happen, so this didn't affect their play in the first round. And then we played the game again saying, okay, now we'll do 2 rounds of contributions. We'll contribute. The first time we'll count how much the group contributed, and then you'll have a chance to top up. So the second time they actually knew this was going to happen. There was anticipation. So this is a game design. There was no refund or rebate. Play was simultaneous. It was single shot. There was absolutely no feedback or communication, so people could not really talk and decide on a strategy, and there were no sanctions. So some equations, but the important thing to remember here is that when people decide how much to contribute, there are many factors that come into play. One is obviously their monetary gain, some non-monetary, warm glow, etc., type of usual components of utility that we think about with respect to a lot of these charitable giving questions or questions related to public goods. And then in this game, we actually had also this feature of reputation, because this is something that was a feature in the revealed game, because your people who live in the same village as you are going to know what you're going to contribute, so presumably you don't want to lose face in front of other people. So this basically looks at how people think about how much to contribute with respect to pivotal areas of influence. So if you are optimistic about, so this basically looks at belief distributions of whether people think that the group will be able to meet the threshold without their help. So if I think that I'm in a group of very generous people, then I will be not likely to contribute very much, because I know that the group will be able to meet the threshold regardless of what we personally contribute. Alternatively, if we are pessimistic about our beliefs and we think that the group is actually not going to be able to make this threshold, that we might also not want to contribute because we're just going to lose the money. There's no rebates. Alternatively, there's an area of pivotal influence, as we see here, this is the dotted line. This is an area where our contribution makes a difference. Depending on how much we contribute, we will either meet the threshold as a group or we will not. So this is exactly the decision point that we are looking at here. And this is an area where contributions basically reveal to us that the person considers themselves pivotal. And similarly here, your payout depends on how much you give to the group. So if you are giving your entire endowment, you're actually right here, right? You're getting 0 as long as there's nothing provided by the public good, but then you're getting the value of the public good if you're actually able as a group to meet the threshold. Alternatively, you can contribute nothing and get the value of your endowment since you have given nothing to the group. But yet if the group manages to meet the threshold without your help, then you're actually able to get twice of your endowment because you're also getting the benefit of the provision of the public good. So the methodological contributions of this paper is, like I mentioned, the asymmetrical feature, the removing the focal point and viewing what people would do in the absence of a fair contribution. The multi-stage conditional contributions, the allowing of the second stage if the threshold is not met at the first stage. And then finally, I'm looking at this measure of the social capital because everybody in the village actually knows each other. So the main results are that social accountability and reputation do matter. So we see that transparency does increase cooperation slightly on average, but we also see that many subjects actually give less when their contributions are transparent. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And the reason is that, like I mentioned before, they just don't view their contribution as pivotal because they know that in a revealed game, everybody else will tend to contribute more, so they give less. Unfortunately, it ends up being that everybody thinks this way. So given that they have no ability to coordinate because there's no communication, everybody kind of assumes that everybody else is more generous than they are, so they can slap off. And then we also see that low endowment players are actually not responsive to transparency. They think, okay, we're poor, we don't really need to make a point out of participating in the revealed treatment because we kind of got the bad side of the randomization by getting the poor endowment. So, and then with inequality and fairness norms, we see that asymmetric conditions actually produce more cooperation. So heterogeneous endowments lead to much higher contributions. So when we have the poor and rich people, we actually end up having higher contributions. And then when fair contributions are disallowed, most subjects actually give more, although some give less. So we actually see a sorting into people who end up giving more and people who end up giving less in these situations. And social capital, as we predicted, varies significantly by village. So to this point, 82% of the games were actually successful in reaching the threshold and cooperating. But a lot of this happened only in the second round, only once people got a second chance to contribute and were told that the first round was unsuccessful, only then were communities able to reach the threshold. Now, the differences across villages were very strong. One village actually cooperated in every single game. It didn't matter what the treatment was, they were just always extremely cooperative. Another village almost never was able to reach the threshold. And again, all of these results were unknown to the people who are playing until much later. So they didn't know that they were failing to cooperate until the results were announced. So this village number 10 was really bad cooperation. And then, of course, like I said before, leadership issues, cooperative history. I mean, some of these villages actually were having these feuds over land. So later on, we actually got qualitative data on what was happening in these villages that actually made them not be very cooperative. Now here, I show you results from the revealed contributions or the anonymous contributions. So we see on average, actually, revealed contributions are a little bit higher. But if we actually look at the difference between the revealed and anonymous contribution per person, what we see is that a lot of people give much more in revealed. So this means that people give 6 tokens more in the revealed game than in the secret game. However, we actually see this large number of people, 1/3 approximately of the people giving less, for these reasons that I was describing earlier. So the median actually is statistically the same across the 2 games, but the distribution of people is different. Thank you. So this basically means that depending on whether you believe that your contribution is pivotal in the revealed game or not, you will either give more if you want to save face and you want to make sure that people know that you're contributing a lot, or you will give less if you don't really care about your reputation and you suspect that everybody else cares more and will give more. So when we look at the expectation of the deviation of what people believe others will contribute, this is confirmed because, So in an anonymous game, people think that pretty much the focal point will be reached. They think that everybody will give 5 out of 10, and that there's going to be maybe a little bit more contribution. In the revealed game, people think that everybody else is going to give far more. So they think that they're going to give 7.6 approximately, which is really a lot. So they believe that their peers are very sensitive to reputation, even if they themselves are not. Now this is again just a different way of presenting the beliefs in the anonymous game, which is on the x-axis, and the revealed game, which is on the y-axis. So again, this is confirmed because we see that a lot of people think that in an anonymous game, everybody else will under-contribute. Specifically, they think that 1/3 of their peers will under-contribute. Whereas they think that only 3% of the respondents believe that anonymous game, or that think about the anonymous game under-contribution, they believe that people in the revealed game will also under-contribute. And the way that they gathered this data through surveys with the players after the game was finished. So while we were tallying the results, we actually asked all the players, what do you think happened? What do you think other people contributed? And they actually gave these predictions for the different types of games. So this was actually done before they knew the results, so they were not affected by the results. So lack of anonymity, as I pointed out, has a heterogeneous effect on contributions, and we can sort the subject pool. So this is kind of my classification of the people who give different amounts. So there's focalists, and 15% of all the players actually give 5 in every treatment. They just think that's fair, and that's it. Then there's some people who give more in the revealed treatment than in an anonymous treatment, and they're the people that they call reputation sensitive. And there are some people who are not sensitive to reputation, but have these optimistic beliefs of other people's contributions, who tend to give less in the revealed game. So here we have 2 graphs of free riders and full cooperators. And we see that people who tend to cooperate, so by full cooperators I mean people who always give more than is necessary. So they're the ones who think that reputation is really important, and they're the ones that seem to be sensitive to reputation. Whereas free riders, they're not sensitive to reputation. So you can see the breakout. So then looking at the second treatment of removing the focal point. So the dark lines show, so for the left side for anonymous contributions and the right side for revealed contributions. The dark lines show what happens when you allow people to contribute any amount of their endowment. Now the light lines right here show what happens if you limit the contributions to only 0, 2, 4, 6, the even numbers. So as we can see, a lot of people actually end up giving 6, which is kind of surprising. Our prior was that people would give actually less because there would be an excuse to kind of not really contribute. But we also see that there is a big bunching at 2 and at 4 as well. So there is again this big distribution between people who choose to give a little bit more and people who give less. So looking just at people who were contributing 5 before, because now their preferred contribution is disallowed, we see again the same pattern remaining, that some people just raise their contribution just a little bit to 6, and this is what the majority of these focal contributors choose to do. But then some of them do use it as an excuse to contribute only 2 or 4, which is kind of surprising because you would think that most people would choose only 2, 4 or 6 because that's closest to their preferred contribution. So as we can see here, people distribute pretty much evenly across the 4 categories. So when we look at the asymmetric endowments, again, a really interesting result, as I mentioned before, people who are viewed as rich and have an endowment of 15 contribute about 50% of their endowment. So I did not randomize the order of the games. This game happened after the previous games happened. So because this was a little bit more difficult for people to understand, so I wanted to make sure they practiced playing the other game first. And they really focused on the anonymous versus revealed treatments, and then this was just adding another layer on top of that by changing the contribution endowments. So the rich people, as you can see, they're contributing far more, but reaching only 50%. And slightly statistically significant is the fact that they give a little bit more in the revealed treatment, clearly responding at least somewhat to the reputation effects of having people know afterwards how much they gave. However, the poor people, I actually thought this was a mistake initially when I calculated the data because it's exactly the same in anonymous and revealed rounds. There's absolutely no difference. And what's interesting is they actually give a much larger percentage of their endowment. One of the reasons they think this is because people were primed to be giving 5. So I think they were trying to get as close to 5 as possible, and they also didn't trust that the rich people would give enough to compensate. But the interesting feature that resulted in this distribution is that in the games where the endowments were heterogeneous, we actually had way more contributions than the threshold. So in almost every single village, this was a treatment where full cooperation was achieved. And instead of giving the threshold of 50, they actually end up giving 65 or 70 even. So very, very large contributions from this particular treatment. So I would say that this is probably the best way to ensure cooperation. So then the other thing I looked at was the individual heterogeneity across the players. And I found that people who are ethnic minorities in the village, who practice monogamous marriage, this is highly correlated with being Christian. So this is an area where there's actually a lot of polygamy. And people who do not have a wage job, so this is more poor people, and slightly wealthier people are the ones who end up giving more. And the last slide basically shows the reputation score. So this was also an interesting feature of this game that I was able to do. I asked everybody afterwards, since they knew everybody in the village and they knew all the other players, even though they were randomly selected, everybody pretty much knew everybody else. I said, who do you think is going to give the most? I mean, look around the room and tell me who you think are the people who you can really trust to give a lot of money. What's interesting is that it was very, very clear, and some of this variation is due to the fact that villages had different social networks, but there were a couple of people who were just named by everyone. Every single person was named. So the reason this is larger than 38 is because I'm combining two questions, both are reputation-based. So here, this person was named by every single person, essentially. And the majority of people weren't named by anyone. So this basically means that, and this is completely private, again, no communication. So people had a very, very strong feeling about who was going to really be a good player in this game and a good collaborator and who's not. Unfortunately, this was completely insignificant in my actual individual results. So basically, even though people had very strong perceived perceptions of who is trustworthy, in this lab game, those people were no more likely to collaborate than anybody else. So this means that maybe their perceptions, and this was asked specifically within the game. It wasn't like, who do you think is really trustworthy? It was like, in this specific game, who do you think collaborated the most? So this basically shows that even though that people cannot really predict very well how people play in private and real games, despite the fact that they have very strong priors. So I don't think I have time for the second chance, but I guess I'll take questions on what I presented so far, because I think I have like 1 minute. Yes?
So if the responses about who you think's most trustworthy, did they predict that person without giving?
They predicted who?
The speaker without giving.
So
the person who tells you, yeah, I think lots of people can be trusted, did that predict that person's?
Yes. So basically, yes, exactly. So people who said that lots of people can be trusted were the ones who gave more. Yeah, exactly. But the higher reputation people were less trusting, actually. So.
Well, basically, we should probably break so we can ask questions individually, and thank all of the speakers very much.